Benvenuti a questa prima intervista.
Welcome to our video. Today we are going to interview two very interesting Damanhurians. Coboldo and Coyote are joining me today, and today we will explore and then try to connect two very interesting chapters. The chapter of politics and the chapter of the esoteric world. So how politics, geopolitics, and magic are actually very connected and intertwined, and we'll try to then associate a series of alternative interpretations to the events that are currently happening in our world. So we'll see other points of view and other perspectives for what concerns the events that are currently happening. And so we have invited two very special guests, Coboldo, our journalist and politics and communications expert, and Coyote, a Damanhurian researcher and citizen who's also a teacher of the Damanhurian school. Was that a fair introduction? Yes, that was perfect. So let's start with the first question, and actually I'd like for both of you to answer it. I'd like to know what you think about what is currently happening in the world. Maybe to start our interview, we can start with this. Your 2 points of view about what is happening and about the direction that humanity is moving towards. Just a few words about how you see all of this. I think this is a moment of change. Peoples are going extinct, they are disappearing, and nations are taking over. And this means that the direction is moving towards business, towards numbers and a stability made of numbers instead of people. Peoples are notoriously interested in living well, so in making sure that people move towards some type of agreed happiness. Nations, as they think of themselves as such, inevitably move towards conflicts. This historical moment is characterized by this. By everyone against everyone and different sides, and all of this, of course, damages people. It is something that then creates a problem for people, not nations. And Coyote, what do you think? From a more esoteric point of view, how do you see all of this? We were talking about conflicts, but what do you think of this aspect? Well, at the beginning of COVID, so we're talking about 2 years ago, several different researchers that I actually agree with identified this moment as the one described by St. John, so the apocalypse, a particular moment of time, the end of an age or an era in which lots of things happen, but in the end, there is a big conflict. A conflict between the classic duality of good forces against evil forces. And according with this interpretation, this event, so COVID, could not have ended in a different way, so by leading towards a big conflict. So from my point of view, we are in this moment described in the Bible as the apocalypse. From my researchers, and even though they're not too detailed, but from what I was able to see, you can very clearly see similarities between the symbolic events described by St. John and the events that are happening right now around us. So this is the vision or the idea from the esoteric point of view. Then can we say that we are in a moment of transformation and transition? So maybe we are moving towards something new, and so maybe something new will come out of this, and these conflicts are part of this game. Also because we are in an environment of war, whether we want to call it a spiritual or physical war, this is the environment. So why in 2022, despite everything that we were able to achieve, nations are still fighting against each other, and there are wars to then obtain what exactly? Well, if we better analyze the situation, I'd say that we've always been in this environment. Maybe right now we're just seeing more wars, or we're noticing it more. The paradox is that seen from those who live in the good old European continent, everything seems peaceful and tranquil. But that's not the case, and it's not been the case since the First World War, and actually from even before the 1700s, the 1800s, where new wars would start every 30 or 40 years. So there is the illusion and the paradox of thinking of ourselves as culturally evolved, and so with a good economy, and so able to create and consume, and to do all of this while living in peace. But unfortunately, This peace, enjoyed by some, is suffered by those that are immersed in continuous wars, and so by those that find themselves basically transported by these situations. And so this unbalanced situation has actually always existed. The new age and a new war could be an attempt to remove parts of this veil of hypocrisy or of illusion, if you prefer, and so to finally become aware of the situation. If this really happened, and of course we hope that it will, it'll take a few years, maybe a decade, and the situations of crisis, from the one hand, will increase the conflicts, so the suffering and the difficulties. But from the other hand, these situations can stimulate people to become more aware of all of this. Sometimes living too well creates this situation of stillness, in which you're not truly aware of what is actually happening. When there is a crisis, so problems, that's when you realize that there's more than just your everyday problems. And it makes you aware of what you have and had. So yeah, it makes you aware of what you once had, and so in losing it, you finally become aware of it. With these crises, these processes are also created. This crisis is also seen as a sort of reawakening of humanity. So maybe it's an important and necessary step to gain awareness about certain things. And so, Coyote, I wanted to ask you this. Does a war have a value on a magical plane? Yes or no? Also, from the point of view of the Damanhurian experience, and so by connecting with what Coboldo said, this type of conflict, can it lead towards a spiritual reawakening? So, from the magical point of view, a war has a very important meaning. It's very difficult to explain, also because it's a pretty raw concept, especially for those that maybe don't have a specific background of research. If we want to translate this into something that's more easily understandable, the dead caused by a war are a sort of nourishment for certain spiritual forces. Obviously, we're talking about negative ones. Negative for what concerns the human evolution. And so if we go back to your initial question, why do these things continue to happen today? Well, first of all, I agree with what Coboldo said. We always had wars, and maybe the current one is just more noticeable. But the general answer is that these wars happen because these negative forces are very much present, and they operate in our world. In our Damanhurian school, in our more magical mission, there is an operation and so work that we do that is meant to free the planet from these forces. And the apocalyptic moment, so the one that I talked about before, is truly the final moment for what concerns this program of reawakening that exists to bring back humanity towards a more positive path. But the apocalyptic moment that, according to the Bible, lasts around 3 to 3.5 years is a complex and difficult moment, as we can see from the events that are happening, and unfortunately its outcome is not something we can be sure of, meaning that at the end, from this point of view, one of these two forces will prevail, but it's extremely difficult to tell which, since what's also playing an important role here is people's free will. So it's impossible to foresee what millions of people will think or do and believe in. So I think it's a process, and so we will just have to wait and see and experience it ourselves. Well, you mentioned something very important, the concept of free will, so the choice. It is actually one of the things that I wrote in my questions, and so what I wanted to ask you, Coboldo, is this about this concept of the choice that for Damanhur is very important. The citizen, their involvement and active participation, what kind of impact can they have? Because we know that many people feel like they don't have the power to do something or to truly change something. When they face something so big, such a big event, they feel powerless. So what do you think of this? And also, from and this is also something that applies to the next questions, I'd like for you to talk more about the experience, your experience in Damanhur. So as Damanhurian citizens, what did you do? What has Damanhur done? Because when we talk about war, or when we talk about the spiritual warrior, so this person that marries a project and then grows with other people and believes in another type of society in which other values guide the human being. If we talk about all of these aspects, then how do you see all of this and how were you able to experience it? So, but for now, how do you see this aspect of the choice and the free will? Well, this is fundamental, I think. And the paradox is that we live in what I call a social moment. Social, so immediate news, immediate images and information, and also an immediate report of everything that happens. Even the war in Ukraine is social from this point of view. It is maybe the first time that a war is transmitted and fought through the news, but then the white supremacist that starts to shoot in a grocery store, mostly used by African Americans, and that wears a GoPro on his helmet to transmit the whole event as it happens, to show his act of protest, which is, of course, a criminal act. What is the difference between the two? The important difference is not just a technological one. It's also that wars are now adapting and being adapted to the technological tools that can be negative when you see them as a passive situation. I witness and see what happens, and in some ways I nourish myself with it, and of course it's not good for me. But on the other hand, seeing something helps you notice what happens. To use other words, in the past, wars were a classic situation. Where there is a war, and the rest of the world discovers it after, or anyways, later. Today, the war is a sort of live stream. So, of course, it's an ugly situation, but I, citizen, become aware of what is happening, and that's where my power of choice intervenes. We all have the power to choose in our behaviors, in the things we say, buy, do, in the relationships we have, and in politics. The problem appears when I renounce my role, and so I refuse to do my part because I say, oh, but there's nothing I can do anyways. And so I just adequate. I think that the Damanhurian experience makes you reflect on the fact that in reality, I'm always the protagonist, and every one of us is always the protagonist, in our own way, in our own parts. And if we put together all of our parts, then that's when we can achieve change, instead of just letting things transport us. So, to recap, the concept of personal freedom exists always and anyways. And so the human being has this principle. And then Coyote, if you want to add something about this, of course, feel free to do it. But so this principle is something we all have, right? We've always had our free will. It's all about using it. And so what do you think of this, Coyote? The free will is the divine power that human beings have. So without it, humans wouldn't have been able to evolve, and we would not even be able to talk about humanity to begin with. And so the free will exists, and it is the most precious and important thing we have. From the esoteric point of view, the negative forces, or the main goal of these negative forces, is to take this power of free will away from us, because our free will, that can be then translated into a simple act of choice, well, it can defeat them. What we define as the negative or enemy force is able to express its power exclusively because nowadays humanity is using a very low percentage of this free will. And so if, for example, is using only 10% of it, then it means that the remaining 90%, humanity has been transported and led in their choices by other things. And so it chooses things, but they're not its actual choices. For example, today countries are joining wars or bringing weapons, but are these their actual choices, or are they simply being transported and forced by a current that leads them in this direction? So the free will is absolutely the most important thing. And here in Damanhur, we grew up with the idea that it is a value that should be reawakened and used in its full potential. Thank you, Coyote. My next question is this. Maybe it's not that we don't have our free will, but maybe in time it is possible to become convinced that we can't really do anything or change anything. Of course, maybe the events that happen around us make us feel immersed in an environment of, let's say, desperation. But so it might just be an influenced belief. And so this power that we have is like a muscle that needs to be trained. And so I wanted to ask both of you, in your paths in Damanhur, can you tell us a practical something or just give us ideas or share experiences, things you use to extract this energy, so this sense of action and responsibility? So what would you suggest and recommend to yourself and to others? So maybe when you feel a bit desperate, what's the best thing to do? What can you extract when you feel this way so as to reignite the flame? I would say the passion and listening to your consciousness. It would be very useful to every now and then talk with our consciousness and to ask ourselves a few things, listening to the answers and then choosing, not with our guts, but with our feelings. So with everything we have. I think this is the only way. The good thing about this moment is that we are being bombarded by information, which is the exact opposite of what used to happen just 50 or 40 years ago. It is less beautiful, the fact that oftentimes the information are channeled in a specific direction, so guided to trigger a sort of collective hypnosis. But I'm convinced that if I listen to my consciousness, I look at the news, of course, and I keep myself updated, but then I listen to what my consciousness says, I have the possibility to make choices. Maybe not always the right ones. You can also make mistakes, but at least I start to express the famous freedom of choice, so the free will. This leads to a chain of events. So depending on what I feel and what I feel is right and mine, then I do certain things. One choice after the other, at some point I'll end up somewhere. At least I won't remain still and ready to suffer this collective hypnosis, which is made of many aspects and guided and created over the years. The morals are collective morals that someone created. They are not exactly mine. This, I think, is fundamental to move our consciousness. Thank you, Coboldo. And Coyote, let me ask you the same thing. What do you do, or what would you suggest to do when you want to ignite this power? Well, I start from the idea that we always have a lot of power, even in those moments in which, like you said, we feel discouraged by what's happening around us. And the territory around us suggests us that we don't have power. In Damanhur, we grew up with the idea and then the practical experience that is this one. When you do certain things with a certain level of energy, the things done here, the choices made here, have always created effects and results somewhere else in the world. This is also documented in the history of Damanhur. And so I think that if in the present, here in Damanhur, right now, we were to think about a new project or launch a new project, and an exciting one, so something that attracts people's interests, this energy or passion, as Coboldo said, that we might express through this project will then create some effects. In the moment in which you're able to achieve something, the feeling you feel is satisfaction, and so you feel like you have power over the things and the events. Here is something that can be transmitted, because here in Damanhur we are in a synchronic knot, one of the most important ones on this planet. So if we here emit certain emotions, then these emotions travel through the synchronic lines and definitely create changes somewhere else on this planet. So our success here would actually create similar feelings and outcomes, and thus effects in many other parts of the world. And maybe people would think less about wars and more about their creative potentials, about what they can do. Thank you. But so, follow-up question. From what I understand from both of you, this would be the case for and if a humanity full of citizens were able to focus more on building something new and giving more space to this creativity. So this would be the case if this were to happen. And the element you mentioned often was this passion. And so this would be possible if this humanity was able to silence the noises from the outside and pay more attention to what they contain inside, this consciousness, and then create something from there. This might be one of the big ingredients. It's one of the things that could really help us overcome or just go through this fog that we are going through, right? Yes, exactly. You always start from somewhere, and this is a very good starting point. Okay, so let's actually enter inside of another very interesting topic, which is the defense. So defense, what does it mean? And here actually I want to ask you, first of all, what this concept means. Maybe a more social plane from the Damanhurian point of view, but also a magical plane by looking at the world around us. For Damanhur, what does defense mean? And today you were saying that peoples are going extinct, they're disappearing, and they're replaced by nations. And so what does defense mean? Maybe we can start from you, Coboldo, and then look at a more magical defense with Coyote. Well, the defense is us. Every one of us is awake and vigilant and is participating to something. The defense is a collective consciousness. It is a collective idea, and it's more or less the same one. It's not important for it to be the exact same one, but participating to this general idea, who we are, what we do in this territory, with who and against who. But all of this is something that you notice more in a community. But it applies to everyone. I live in a territory. Earth is not mine, but it's what we are using. The resources of the earth and also the consequences of our behaviors. Well, all of this is something that makes me aware that I live in a context. This is what gives me an idea of the fact that it's not just me with my personal needs and my personal desires and frustrations, but there is a bigger situation around me. And so this means that we notice that there is something bigger than us and bigger than our little stories. And so together is something that we can affront. And this is fundamental. It creates a cement, or it's a glue, a very important glue to then do lots of things together. So the idea of belonging to something, to a context or a group, is the idea that then pushes you to make some extreme choices of defense. And it's evident. I mean, the perception or sensation that the Ukrainian citizen has to not only defend themselves and their family and their territory, but their people is something that pushes them to react in a certain way, even if they don't have experience or a specific background. It's an extreme example because, of course, the war is always something terribly ugly, but it helps you focus and notice all of these aspects. But even without a war, these are basic behaviors. To be inside of something that's not just mine, but it's ours. It's actually a very beautiful concept. What would you add, Coyote, from a more magical point of view? Even though I think that the concept of people, maybe it is also connected to this. From what I understand, the people is an instrument and a tool of defense by itself. So what would you add about this, about the concept of magical defense? Both a personal one, but also for a group of people. Well, the defense is based on having a collective identity of the people. But how do you maintain a people? How do you preserve it? The most important thing from my point of view is to make sure that the people elaborates their own culture and series of meanings for what concerns the reality that surrounds us. So you are very weak when you just collect the same meanings that others have transmitted to you and meanings that you've not elaborated for yourself. You're strong, and so you can defend yourself when you have your own values. Or maybe you also have, let's say, values that already exist or exist in other parts of the world, but then you were able to elaborate them and add your own interpretation to them. So I'll give you an example. Here in Damanhur, we use technology and we really rely on it, but we've also re-elaborated it and connected it to our vision, or at least we tried to do it, and it applies to many other things. And so I think that defense means having your own meanings for things. It's very interesting because I actually wrote this down, the concept of cultural defense. Also, by connected to what you said, that the fact that the peoples are disappearing, and so maybe peoples are the containers of cultures, from customs to music and traditions and even language, so many things. So just how important is your own personal identity and culture to maintain a state of defense from a cultural and social point of view? It's fundamental. We need to recognize ourselves in something. Now, this doesn't mean that we cannot be influenced by other cultures, but if we have a strong connotation, a strong identity, then we can also better appreciate other customs and other aspects, cultural aspects. So what happens if the opposite thing happens? In the globalization, basically, if this process eats my own characteristic and my own identity, so I just do what the others do and I eat the same things that others eat and I behave in the same way, so I no longer recognize myself in something that's mine, and I just melt inside of a completely uncontrollable situation, uncontrollable by me, so something that just transports me. So the peoples of nature, they all have a very strong identity. Usually, when they meet other peoples of nature, they exchange and they share, so they all learn new things. Of course, conflicts also exist between peoples of nature, so there's no absolute perfection here. But in the moment in which we will become able to use the term globalization, so I know and use others and customs from others, but use all of this with intelligence, then that's when we'll make a very important jump, or we'll take another step forward. This is a very beautiful concept, an extraordinary concept. And so here, maybe you can talk more about this aspect. You can talk about the importance of giving value to the differences. So the world that fights to make everything the same, everything similar. And then there's this healthy fight towards diversities. And so maybe we can start from you, Coyote. Damanhur defines itself as a magic people. So what does it mean? And how is this concept of diversity, how is it connected with the concept of people? Well, first of all, we have to clarify this. In the more spiritual or magical meaning, the concept of people does not identify a group of individual that lives in a geographical location, but it identifies something that's a lot more advanced. So a group that shares a story and ideals, and so a group that has created their own language, ideally. So it's a whole series of values, culture, music, art, etc. So once we have this type of sharing, this type of group that shares all of these things and many more, then that's when you can truly consider yourself as a people from the magical point of view. And what I want to add is that on the spiritual plane, this people that is the creation of a series of individuals, at some point it becomes its own being. Maybe it's almost like seeing an entity created by the interaction between different people. And so in Damanhur, this has happened, and it's something that was followed in time with specific knowledge, also technical and specific magical knowledge. And so when we say that Damanhur is a magic people, this is what it means. It means that we have basically some birth dates. And so we have very specific dates connected to the birth of the people. And so then what you were saying about giving value and importance to the diversities, this is one of the key ingredients that maintains the people alive and the evolution of the people alive. Because the evolution is based on exactly that, on the fact that there are different parts that work, but they work together, just like in a human body, when we have lots of different organs, and the fact that they are all work together is what makes our body work. That's beautiful. Do you want to add something about this concept of people, Coboldo? No, I agree with Coyote. It is exactly this. From a certain point of view, the better the knowledge and the better this knowledge is used, the better the benefit, of course. We all have flaws, and so it is not something perfect. It doesn't take much to distract yourself, and it does take a lot of time and effort to improve the consciousness and the awareness. But I think this is also the goal. I fully agree, yes. And so let's open another chapter of this interview, even though you briefly mentioned it before, something very interesting, which is the importance of information, where to find the right information, fake news, and etc. But so I'd like to talk more about this aspect, or anyways, just explore it a little bit. And also I like to maybe use a more magical vision or logic that I think Damanhur has used, but I'd like to just talk more about the sources of knowledge. You often talked about consciousness or applied consciousness and applied knowledge. And so